everyone, welcome to month 3 of the Gardens Block of the Month. This month we are going to be making these really fun, sweet cross-stitch blocks. They're also known as X blocks because they're in the shape of a cute little X. They are so much fun to make. They also are very versatile. Besides being used as a border for this quilt, they can be used all on their own to make a lot of really fun patterns. My first love is cross-stitching. I started cross-stitching when I was a little girl, and to this day it's still one of my very favorite things to do, and I just love so much that I can bring that element of design and fun and whimsy to a quilt with these X blocks or cross-stitch blocks. I'll kind of use the term back and forth. So we are going to make those today. You can see them in the quilt. This is my original super duper scrappy version of the Gardens. Here's a version with that dark navy blue background. So you can see here that we use them in this next border around the orange peels, and in the center we start here with the lightest and then we go out to the next color, more of a medium, and then medium dark, and then in the corners are the darkest. The pattern will show you exactly how many of each block to make and where they get placed. In this video, I'm going to take you through the process, the technique, which is a slice and insert technique for making the individual blocks. I'm going to show you using just a regular white background. As you know, I'm making my own here with the linen, and as I was making the linen X blocks, I kind of just came to the realization that they aren't the best ones to show as a demonstration in a video, simply because the linen is so bulky. I don't want you to have a skewed perspective on how they're made. So I'm going to show you using just a regular solid background, and I think that it will give you just a much more realistic perspective of making these blocks. I'll walk you through making the block, each of the steps, and then the instructions will walk you through assembling it to your quilt. So we'll just jump right in to what supplies you need. You'll need a couple of rulers. You'll need a rectangular one for cutting your strips. You'll need a square ruler for trimming up your X blocks. We're going to be sewing straight grains to bias grains. So stabilizing with starch is going to be really helpful and make this process much more easy for you as you go along. So we'll just jump right into fabric preparation and get started on making these blocks. Our fabrics, let's get it starched. These blocks are so much easier to make when our fabrics are starched and stable. We're going to be working with bias grains and straight grains and cutting them up in all different directions. So starching your fabric, getting it stable is going to help a ton, I promise. If you're not normally a starcher, give it a try for these blocks. Maybe even try a block without starch and one with, and I think you'll see how much it really, really helps. Now, this pattern requires, if you're doing the ombre, a yard of the coral. And if you're anything like me at all, starching a whole yard of fabric just seems like, oh my gosh, no way, I don't want to starch a whole yard of fabric. So what I like to do is chunk it. I'll starch or cut off what I need, and then I'll just work with that, and then I'll cut another piece and work with that, and cut another piece and starch and work with that. It just helps break it up into manageable parts. If you like to iron and starch, then feel free to do the whole yard, but also chunking it into more manageable, smaller pieces might make it the job a little bit more friendly to you. So what I'm going to do here is just start with my darkest. We need 4 X blocks of the darkest color, so I'm going to starch in this area first. Now please follow the pattern that shows you how many strips are going to be cut out of each area. I'm only going to show you one or two, but you're going to need that layout to know how many to cut out from the different areas of the ombre, so you can keep your colors going the way that you want them to be. So let's start with the dark for this. I'm going to use my big iron to press out this large area. Now, I starch in a couple different ways. While I was talking just now, I was letting the starch sink and soak in, and that was intentional. If you want to do that, give it a couple of seconds to soak in so the starch doesn't get on your iron and get it all flaky and gross. The other thing that I do, let's move up into this area just for an example. And I show this in other videos of mine, so you've probably seen it, but it's always nice to see it again on repeat. I spray, let it settle. Again, that Faultless is my favorite. You can get it at Target, Walmart, and it's the gold bottle. That's my favorite. Usually it's $2.50 or less a bottle. And then I'm going to flip it over. And what that does is allows me to press right away and pushes that starch up into the fibers of the fabric, and it keeps my iron clean and flake free. So give that a try and do it once to twice on each side of your fabric just to keep it even. So I'll flip that over again. And then press. And do press until it's dry. Some people like to leave their fabric and let it dry with the starch on it. You can do that. Some people roll it up. It's really personal preference. I don't feel like there's a wrong way, but definitely give it a try if you're flipping it over, pressing and flipping, if you find that your fabric gets flakes or your iron gets dirty and gets flakes. Let's get cutting the dark area of the fabric first. We have 4 blocks that are dark. I'm going to start cutting out the strips with my selvage to my left because I'm going to cut some long skinny strips, and cutting them up and down for me is easier. We're going to cut these strips parallel to the selvage here because the strips are long and skinny, and that gives us strips that won't stretch because the length grain along the length of the selvage is less stretchy than the width grain here. Plus, that gives us the ability to use the ombre of this fabric the way that I want to. If you prefer to have your ombres going along the width so that you get a gradient within your strip, you can. But if you want a continuous color within your strip, cut it along the length of the selvage. So we're going to start there, and you can use any ruler you need to. We're going to start by cutting about a 4-inch strip. Again, please refer to the instructions. So I'm going to cut a nice long strip here, and then I'm going to subcut it into my smaller strips. Okay, so I'm going to put that aside. I'm just going to use this strip. Of course, I'll be using more of that ombre, but we're just going to do it in small chunks like I mentioned, just to make it more manageable. For the X blocks strips, the strips that make the actual X's, you are going to need a ruler that has those 1/8 inch measurements. So just make sure yours does. If you don't have one that does, do your best, but the Creative Grid rulers are great for that. They're, again, my favorites for those markings. And I'm going to cut my strips here. I'm going to cut 2. My 2 strips are ready to cut again. I'm just going to lay them right on top of each other. And the most important measurement here really is the width. The ends are going to be longer than they need to be, and we're going to trim those up later, but this width is really, really important to keep accurate. So do as good of a job as possible with that measurement. And then we'll subcut these. And I like to put that line on the ruler along a cut line so I can really make sure it's nice and straight. And cut that one, make sure this one is long enough, and it is. And now I've got enough here to make 2 blocks. I'm going to cut some background fabric really quick. So I've already pressed the background fabric that I'm going to use for this part of the tutorial. Here we're going to cut some squares, and you're going to, again, refer to the pattern to see how many squares you need total. And we'll cut this off just to get it out of my way. Sometimes when I'm cutting, I do it on videos anyway. I'll show you that I'm cutting it kind of cockeyed on the mat to show you don't need the measurements on the mat for cutting your smaller pieces. Just use your ruler. Anytime your cut is smaller than the ruler, just keep the lines within the area of the ruler and you will be all set. We're just about to get into making that first block. Oh, I missed that little corner. That's why it's so important to hold that ruler in place. All that scrap. For each block, you're going to need 2 strips and 1 square. So follow the instructions to cut the amount of strips and squares that you need to make the lattice wall. The next thing we gotta do is cut these squares in half on the diagonal only once. So we'll just stack 2 on top of each other, and you can do them individually. I don't stack more than 2. I don't want to get them shifty. And align your ruler right down that diagonal from point to point. Here, let's get it off that white so you can see it better. And then from point to point, just cut it right down the center. Get 2 triangles and 1 strip. And essentially we're going to be putting 1 triangle on each side of the strip, but the trick is getting them centered and all aligned. So we'll use some folding techniques. So fold your strip in half and give yourself a finger press. Fold each of your triangles in half and just finger press along that long edge. You don't need to do the whole thing. Just right there. Match your points and then pinch. That's all you need to do. And then we know exactly where it's centered. So we'll start with a little glue. You can do the gluing along the edge of the triangle or the strip, it doesn't matter. And gluing these is so much easier than trying to align this at the machine or pin, because what we're working with here, let's go back, is a bias cut and a straight cut. So these are going to feed differently under your machine just naturally. This one is going to be a lot stretchier. This one is going to be more stable. So when we glue baste and line up those creases here, when we glue baste and heat set it, you aren't going to get any uneven stretching at all. They're going to line up just right at your machine, and they won't shift off or stretch or any nonsense like that. Now you can mark these with a pen or a pencil. I prefer the folds. Just make sure you don't use a friction pen to mark, because if you heat set and you've marked over here with a friction pen, the marking goes away. So just keep that in mind. I like the folds. And line up the fold on that side, heat set, and see, look, this way we can do both sides at the same time too, which helps with efficiency too. And heat set, and we'll repeat for the second strip for that block and fold them in half. And you could just sit and fold everything, of course, completely up to you. Just a little pinch. And we will sew right along these edges at our machine. So at the machine, I sewed the seams for each side of the strips at about a scant 1/4 inch. Just stay consistent, whatever your choice is. And now we'll go ahead and set the seams, and we'll press out away from the strips. Just like that. The thread that I use for sewing these is the Soie Surfing number 2134. It is in our thread set, and it matches the coral really nicely. It's silk, so it's nice and fine and strong, and just works so nice to give us a lovely flat seam. Now, the method that we're using for these is often referred to it as a slice and insert. Another option would be paper piecing, but I really like doing it in this method here. So next we are going to cut these apart along this diagonal, which you can see how important now getting these matched up is, because we want these to be equal on each side of that cut. An alternative to pressing the triangles out would be to press toward the strip. So there really isn't a huge difference. I've made this quilt both ways, and the only thing I find that really makes a difference is the color of your background in relation to your preference for whether or not your seams show. I don't feel like it makes a big difference in construction wise. The instructions will show you pressing them out. If you want to press them in, you certainly can. And if you do that, it will also make the strip, the X part, pop up, which is really nice for quilting if you want to give more attention to the X being in the foreground and the white or your choice of background color being in the background. It'll push it back, and then this will be kind of pulled up to the foreground a little bit more. So if you do it that way, you need to make sure you press all the way to the ends of your strip. Don't just press off like this. You need to make sure you go straight all the way down when you press. And doing it from the front, it's really easy to get this portion off. So make sure that you keep that going straight, or the X block will not come together correctly. So just be really careful with that if this is your pressing preference. Again, the instructions will show it the other way, but you can certainly make it go this way. And these are going to be so cute. These can be used for so many things. Even if you're not doing the block of the month, you can make some really cute cross-stitch style quilts and all sorts of fun things with this type of a block. So right down the center we're going to cut. Now, this part's really important. If for some reason these points were offset for some reason, we want to get this part nice and even, so our X's are nice and straight and not all wobbly. In order to do that, align your seam line here along a straight continuous measurement. Whatever that is, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's straight, and then down here, remember we cut at 1/8 of an inch, so this measurement is not going to land at an exact measurement because this was cut at 1/8 measurement at 7/8, but at an 1/8 inch mark. So this one is going to be off, but if you can get it just so it looks pretty darn straight, and this one is straight, and we're going down the center here, you are going to be just fine. So we'll cut that right down the middle and align again. Again, it doesn't matter which alignment line you use. You just want to make sure it's straight. It's just a way to double check. I like to double check when at all possible, so then you don't have any surprises later on. After cutting one of those strips with triangles right down that center, just give it another press. It helps a lot. You can even give it a light starching, get those little triangles to lay down nice and flat. Get that second strip for that block, and we are going to place it just like this, and you can see how it will then become our X block, and then we'll sew it together and trim it up really nice. We are going to align these just like we did the other, just in the same exact way as we added these triangles to that other strip, you're going to find your center of that strip and crease it, and then you're going to fold this in half. Kind of like to use my board. Fold it in half, match your corners, and then put a little pinch right there in the center. Again, you can mark it with a pencil if you prefer. Give it a little pinch. So again, get your glue. Draw that fine line of glue on the inside edge. And then align your creases. And if your fabric doesn't show a crease very well, just mark it with a pencil. Align your edges and heat set. You can align the other edge also just by lifting this up and placing that on there. If that's too cumbersome, do this for all of your strips, and then you can go and chain piece everything. It makes it go really fast. We'll just go ahead and sew right down this seam. Make sure you use the same seam allowance that you used for sewing these. Okay, I've sewn that one side. Let's set that seam. It's especially important, everybody, super duper important. Set that seam when you are matching up a bias grain and a straight grain. That way it prevents those yucky ripples that happen along a bias grain seam. And then we're going to press out away from the strip, just like we did when we pressed this originally. In the previous section of the video about pressing, I showed you with this strip here how you can press in to kind of make that X pop up. So if you are wanting to continue that with this portion of the assembly, do the same thing and just press toward that strip instead of away from the strip toward the triangles. There's not a right or wrong with this. It's really a preference. The instructions are going to show the other direction. This one just requires a little bit more attention at the ends of the strips. So just make sure you pay attention to that as you're going. So press out toward the triangles and give it a little extra attention right here, because you do have a little bit of a bulkiness happening here, which is not a big deal. You just want to make sure you get it pressed nicely. Draw your fine line of glue close to that edge. And then align your creases. Now at this point, what you can also do is align your creases, but also make sure that this strip continues down. See how you can tell that the X is going to continue through and be straight? This is big, you guys. This is big, big. Simple little thing to check. But if you were off just a smidge, then your X wouldn't continue in a straight line through the block. So we want to make sure it is aligned, and the second thing to do is just to fold that up and make sure that your seams above and below match, and then you'll know that it'll go just straight through the block and will look lovely. All right, so now this is ready to sew, and then it'll be ready to press and trim to size. The last side is sewn, and again, you can prep all of your blocks, sew them all in a chain, and just keep on going, and it makes it go by efficiently and quickly, so you can get all of the blocks made for your lattice wall. So set that seam. We're going to press out. Again, if you want to switch it and press in, you can. Totally up to you, but just be consistent. And we'll set that seam, or press that seam there. And if need be, you can give it a little press with some starch just to keep it nice and flat. You don't need much. I know some people say, oh, why do you starch so much? But I don't really starch that much. It might look like it, but it's really it's such a light starching, not heavy. My fabric is hardly wet at all, but it does give it just that little extra stabilization that it needs. So next up, we'll trim to size. So we're ready to trim up our block, and it's going to be 4.5 inches square. And we have alignments right down both centers. That should be right at about 2 1/4. But you know, even more important than that, while that is really important, is what's happening out here at the corners, since we are going to join multiple X's together. In order to get them to match up nicely, aligning and getting the right cut here at the corners is going to be just as important. So just to start with, we'll go ahead and use a square ruler, align your center diagonal right down the center. Our center lines here will be at 2 1/4 because our block is 4 1/2, and we'll just kind of eyeball that. But as I was mentioning, just as or even more important is what's happening here at this corner. This corner, if you can get your ruler to where it's the corner is matching at the 1 inch mark here and here, as well as getting these as close as possible to the 2 1/4 line, you'll get your corners so that they will match up to each other as you make and assemble the X's to each other. So if that is something important to you, I like having mine match up as much as possible. And then down here at the 3 1/2, I want the start of my X seam here to be right at about 3 1/2, and over here right at the 1 inch over. So that looks really good to me. I'm going to leave it and cut it. And I'm going to be really happy that those corners are going to look really good. Okay, so look at that, that's so nice. Now I have a trued up corner, so I'm going to spin it around. I'm going to line my trued up corner at the 4 1/2, and hopefully everything will be pretty close to about the 1 inch. Now over here, since we want it at 4 1/2, we're looking at the 3 1/2 line here to see that that seam kind of intersects through the 3 1/2 and close to the 1. That is not close to the 1 at all. Sometimes that will happen. If the rest of them are pretty darn close, then I'm okay. Who knows how that happened? You know, when I'm doing a video and I can't get really close because I have to work up above, I don't see little mistakes as easily, but what I would do here is this one would just go into the border or into the edge where it doesn't have to match up with another block. So there's always ways around those little things that we don't like. But this matches, this matches, this matches, and that one will just be off, and I will be just fine. It'll just go, oops, oh shoot. Did you see how that happened? I was talking. So if that happens to you and you're cutting, stop cutting. Don't keep cutting and make it worse. All right, only a bit of it will be worse. See, you can hardly tell. Oof, be careful. This will be off a little bit, but I'll just put that into a border and nobody will know. It won't match up because this is one of the dark ones anyway. So it'll be just fine. So don't worry about it not being perfect. I am fussy for me. And my stuff is far from perfect, but I do my best to compensate to make things look as good as I can because my eyes always go to my mistakes. And when I can minimize my own mistakes, I will do what I can. So that's kind of what I like to do for you all, is help you minimize little things like that that might bother you later. If they don't bother you, then don't even worry about it. We all just have to work in the way that works best for us and kind of figure out our own styles of learning and all those things that just to help us make making even more fun. So here's our block. They're done. We'll make all of the ones we need for the lattice wall portion of the quilt. Follow the instructions for how to make each one. You're going to assemble them pretty much just like everything else that we've done for the quilt so far. The rest of the instructions for putting the X blocks into your quilt and adding on the next border are in the instructions. Those portions aren't going to be in the video this time. It's very repetitive. It's just like what we've done before, where you are going to piece, here's in a second block. So you'll piece each of your blocks together in rows and then assemble those rows to the quilt. It's very, very much like when we did the garden pond, when we added the squares for the orange peels, and when we added the border for the orange peels. So if you need a little refresher, go back to those videos and they will help you with all of the seaming and sewing and pressing and getting all of that done. And then putting these X blocks together will be super duper easy for you. And when you do piece them together, you'll just align them right sides together, and hopefully these little seams will match up. When you are piecing these together, it's really important to just keep in mind, or in the back of your mind, that all four corners are a bias grain, so they are going to have the potential to stretch. The reason they're a bias grain is we cut these strips on a straight grain, which puts the bias at the corner. It's not ideal. The other option would be to cut a whole bunch of bias cut strips and use them for piecing in for the X's, and then we'd have a straight grain at the corner, and you could do that too. In order to keep these corners from stretching or causing you problems with fraying or anything like that when you're working with them, is to continue glue basting to join them together. The glue basting is going to help a ton in the event that you are having any difficulty managing those bias grain corners. And for any block you do work on that has a bias grain in the corner or along the edge, glue basting is always going to be a really great, helpful tool. And be sure to share all of the your progress on our Facebook page, Instagram, with the Gardens BOM, the Gardens Block of the Month, and Lattice Wall block. That way I can give you some love and say hi and tell you what a great job you're doing. Please let me know if you have any questions at all, and I will answer them in the comments or over at the Facebook page. And I will see you all next month for month 4.